Can everybody please take a seat? You have a Swedish chairman, and that means we actually try to start on time here, even if we are in the European Parliament. I would like to welcome everyone to this hearing with the Commissioner-designate for Crisis Management, Janez Lenarčič from Slovenia. We have 3 hours and 25 questions in front of us, some of which will be asked by our colleagues from the Committee on Environment, DEVE, which is associated to this hearing. Before we start, I would like to go over the formalities and the setting for this hearing. Let me remind you that in the line of the guidelines of approval of the Commission, the Parliament evaluates Commissioner-designate on the basis of their general competence, the European commitments, and the personal independence. It also assesses the knowledge of their portfolio and their communication skills. Before the hearing, the Commissioner-designate has replied in writing to preparatory questionnaire. The written answers have been distributed to members in all languages. We do note that the Committee on Legal Affairs has raised no objection to holding this hearing. And as I said previously, the Committee on Environment, Public Health and Food Safety is associated to this hearing. Next, as for the structure of this debate, the Commissioner-designate is invited to make an opening oral statement of no longer than 15 minutes. He will then also have 5 minutes at the end of the hearing for a closing statement. After the introduction, there will be time for 25 questions from members of the European Parliament. The debate will be held in accordance with slots of 5 minutes each, with 1 minute for question and 2 minutes for answers from the candidate commissioner. In case there will be a follow-up question, the question should not be longer than 1 minute, and also the reply. The first round will be of 7 questions, and they will be asked by the representatives of the political groups. The second round of 18 questions are based in the overall distribution of questions among the political groups, including also representatives from the non-attached members. Colleagues, I would like to remind you that it is very important that you strictly keep within your allocated speaking time. Today we also have interpretations in 23 languages, and you are therefore welcome to speak in your own language. However, please try to speak slow, because then everything will be perfectly translated so we understand each other. And just like the hearing we have already had in DEVE before, please also try to remove your headphones when you ask the questions, and then we will not have a problem with the techniques. I would also like to inform you that this debate will be streamed live at the Parliament's internet site, and it will also be possible to access a video recording of the hearing on the same site. Now, Mr. Lenarčič, again, a warm welcome to our committee. Before I give you the floor and you can do your opening remarks, I would like to emphasize the importance of your portfolio for this committee, and say that we do hope to see great collaboration from you and the Commission if you should be accepted as nominee. Humanitarian aid is central to the work of this committee. Over 100 million people worldwide are in the need for humanitarian assistance. Humanitarian crises are becoming more frequent, longer and more complex, driven by conflicts, natural disasters and climate change. Only humanitarian funds will never be enough. But this committee looks forward to cooperating with the Commission to ensure that sufficient humanitarian funding is made available and disbursed in the most transparent and efficient manner. The European Union has made important international commitments regarding humanitarian aid in recent years, and they will now be put into place by the next Commissioner. We very much look forward to hearing from Commissioner-designate today and the plans, how you will work with the commitments that have been made at the World Humanitarian Summit and the Grand Bargent, and how it will be implemented, and exactly what role the Parliament can play in monitoring this. Mr. Lenarčič, again, warm welcome to this committee. The floor is yours for 15 minutes.
Honourable Chair, honourable members, I have been handed a double honour. Firstly, to be nominated as Slovenia's candidate to join the next College of Commissioners. And secondly, subject to your agreement, to take on the responsibility of humanitarian aid and civil protection under the banner of crisis management. As a Slovenian, I can most strongly relate to the fact that what is today the Directorate General for European Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid Operations was created in 1992, also as a response to the wars on the territory of the former Yugoslavia. That same year, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees set up a field office in Slovenia. Just before graduating from law school, I joined them to help take care of refugees fleeing to or through Slovenia. This gave me an opportunity for my first modest contribution to humanitarian work. More than a quarter of a century on, I am before you as a Commissioner designate. If entrusted with this task, I can assure you I will dedicate all my energies and almost 3 decades of experience in international and European fora to help alleviate suffering and provide relief to people affected by crisis, thereby confirming European solidarity, a value I strongly believe in. Honourable members, the EU is widely recognized as a responsible global leader in humanitarian aid, and we should take pride in that. However, in order to strengthen its global role, the EU must upgrade its capacities to be able to help more people in need swiftly and efficiently. Currently, the EU reaches out to over 100 million people in need each year, both inside and outside the Union. This directly affects the lives of men, women and children, without discrimination on the basis of their nationality, race, gender, religious belief, class or political opinions. It is reassuring to note that some 90% of Europeans support the EU's action in both humanitarian aid and civil protection. I also know these endeavours have traditionally enjoyed strong support in this Parliament. I can assure you that I have every intention to work with you in partnership, to keep you informed and to listen to your views and concerns. Honourable members, as much as my nomination means an extraordinary opportunity to serve the European Union, I am also acutely aware of the plethora of challenges that the portfolio of crisis management entails. Today, ever more people around the world need humanitarian assistance. Almost 71 million people are forcibly displaced, and not only because of conflicts. Each year, some 70,000 people die, and further 70 million people are injured, left homeless, or in need of emergency assistance as a result of natural disasters. Next to casualties, the costs are high and they continue to grow. Since 2010, natural disasters have caused over 13 billion euro of damage each year in Europe alone. What is worse, the trends we face are worrying. Humanitarian crises last longer and are more complex than ever before. Natural and man-made disasters occur with increasing frequency. More and more people are affected, including in Europe. By 2050, There may be over 140 million internally displaced people in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. How many of them will pick up what has been left to them and migrate to other places, including to Europe, in search of a better life? The resources globally available for crisis management do not match today's needs, let alone future projections. The funding gap is widening. Then there is climate change, rapidly transforming the risk landscape, adding more strain to an already strained system. In report after report, we learn more about climate change and its impacts. Rising sea levels, increasingly frequent and intense storms, longer periods of drought, more devastating floods. Life support ecosystems are under duress. But do we need another report to convince us of the gravity of climate change? The young generation obviously does not. They know for a fact that our house is on fire. To make matters worse, parts of the world hit hardest by the effects of climate change are also among the most fragile and least resilient. Countries of the Sahel and the Horn of Africa, to cite just a couple. This is the stark reality that I will face as Commissioner for Crisis Management. I realize that the picture I painted looks bleak, but I'm not resigned. If anything, I look at the challenges I have just outlined also as opportunities. Opportunities to do things better and differently, to build on what works and to fix what does not. I also realize that in many ways I can be grateful for determination and achievements of my predecessors, of highly motivated staff of DG ECHO, international partners, and most importantly, individual relief workers. Due to their tireless contributions, things by and large work. In addition, the EU is highly respected for its strict adherence to basic humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. I intend to firmly defend these principles also in the future. Turning now to my priorities, I have said, if confirmed. Firstly, as Commissioner for Crisis Management, as well as the European Emergency Response Coordinator, my first goal will be to support people in need as rapidly and efficiently as possible, in full respect for humanitarian principles. In this regard, I will maximize the efficiency and effectiveness of our crisis response so as to reach the maximum people in need. This can only happen if we are able to work together better. In line with the mandate given, I intend to strengthen the EU's Emergency Response Coordination Centre so that it can respond swiftly and effectively to a broad range of crises. Also highly important, if confirmed, I will strongly focus on advocating globally in support of international humanitarian law. In my contacts with state and non-state actors, I will firmly urge the preservation of humanitarian space. It is unacceptable that humanitarian actors are increasingly being targeted and their access to people in need regularly blocked. Secondly, in line with the proposed mandate, I intend to intensify EU's efforts to prevent disasters from occurring in the first place, while also strengthening our capacity to adapt to changing environment. In light of climate change projections, protracted conflicts and increasing instability around the world, we, the European Union and its member states, must work in an integrated manner. Our failure to do so risks jeopardizing the attainment of Sustainable Development Goals, which is a collective responsibility. In this respect, I welcome the working approach envisaged by the President-elect, whereby each Commissioner will need to ensure the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals within their respective policy area. On the side of prevention, I intend to work closely with the High Representative Vice President and other members of the College responsible for areas such as climate change, environment and development. The aim is to ensure that disaster risk reduction becomes an integral part of our efforts to enhance the resilience of our societies and ecosystems, starting with the European Green Deal. Honourable members, humanitarian aid and disaster response must be seen as instruments of last resort. They should step in when all else has failed. Avoiding such failure must remain our first objective. When we have to mobilise humanitarian aid, our goal should be to depend on it for as short time as possible. In other words, we need to move people out of the emergency ward as fast as possible into recovery so that they can benefit from more long-term sustainable solutions. Here, security and development policies play a particularly crucial role. In fragile countries, especially those with protracted crises, we need to work towards a humanitarian development peace nexus. We must take local specificities into account, deliver the best possible assistance to those in need, while paying particular attention to the most vulnerable groups, like women and children. This will require new partnerships as well as innovative tools. Here, in particular, I want to do more to empower local actors in delivering aid on the ground. They know the context best, they can work more efficiently, and they know what works. At the same time, we all know that despite efforts, not everything can be prevented. Recent events, including the deadly forest fires in Portugal, have shown that we must get better at preventing disasters, and we must be better prepared to respond when prevention fails. This is why I intend to vigorously pursue a strengthened implementation of RESC-EU, the Enhanced Union Civil Protection Mechanism, in close collaboration with the Member States. We need reinforced capacities to deal with forest fires, acute medical emergencies, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear disasters. And here, I also count on the support of the European Parliament to help make this a reality. My third priority will be to enhance the visibility of EU's crisis management. I want to build on the strong support European Union's humanitarian aid already enjoys among European citizens. And I want to reassure them that every single euro spent in this area is euro well spent. Our most important audience should be EU citizens and beneficiaries. I will therefore place high priority on communication to them. Honourable members, I will not hide the fact that these priorities and objectives come at a cost. But rather than speaking of cost, I would prefer to speak of investment. In this case, investment in our common future. For this, I call on your support in securing the proposed 30% increase of the humanitarian aid budget as part of the next multi-annual financial framework. This is essential for delivering our ambitious agenda over the next 5 years and beyond. I would also value your continued support to ensure efficient and effective budgetary spending. For my part, I will guarantee that funding is disbursed to those in need transparently and on the grounds of sound financial management. In carrying out my responsibility, I will stand ready to work closely with both committees present here. If I succeed in winning your trust, I would want us to look back in 5 years' time and see that we have made a difference, that we have helped to alleviate the suffering of many, that we have contributed to more resilient communities and individuals, a healthier and more resilient natural environment, and to greater trust of Europeans in their future. Thank you.
Thank you for that opening, Commissioner Designate. I will now start the first round with representatives from the political groups, and I will now give the floor to Jörgi Hölveni from EPP.
Many thanks, Mr. Chairman. Dober večer, gospod Lenarčič. I will continue in my mother tongue. Take your headset. Tisztelt biztos.
Commissioner Designate, according to data released by the UNHCR in July 2019, 186,604 Syrian refugees returned to Syria from Egypt, Jordan, Turkey and Iraq between 2016 and July 2019. Although there is no peace in Syria, these figures indicate that in certain parts of the country, reconstruction has begun. Many of the 5 million refugees who have fled the country will decide to return in the coming months. The problems of approximately 6 million internally displaced persons will also have to be addressed. These people want to get on with their lives in the land of their ancestors. This includes the Christian minority whose members have suffered terrible persecution at the hands of Islamic State. We need to give them all the help we can. After more than 8 years of war, these people need basic services, including basic infrastructure, drinking water, healthcare, and education. For Syrians to be able to exercise their right to stay, these basic conditions have to be provided. Given this context, Commissioner Designate, how do you intend to help returning Syrian refugees and provide for their basic humanitarian needs?
Thank you, Mr. Hölveni. I would just like to remind everybody that we need to keep within the 1 minute. See this as an example that it was too many seconds over the 1 minute. But now I give the floor to Commissioner Designate.
Thank you, Honourable Member, for this question. I will pursue the principled position when it comes to returns. That means we will support returns, promote returns that are safe, that are dignified, and that are sustainable. And perhaps, even more importantly, that they are voluntary. For the time being, my assessment is that the conditions are still not there in Syria for such returns to take place. I agree with you completely that reconstruction of Syria will require enormous investment. But we are not there yet. We are not there yet for obvious reasons. The conditions also for other instruments and tools of the European Union are also not there. Development assistance in particular. We are not forgetting about internally displaced persons in Syria, within Syria. Actually, the Commission is providing the bulk of the assistance to these people through neighboring countries, but also through Damascus. In doing so, in providing humanitarian need for IDPs and refugees of Syria, we do not make any distinctions on the basis of religious belief. In line with the principles that I mentioned already in my opening speech, the principles that govern the humanitarian assistance, and among them is the principle of impartiality, which I intend to vigorously defend. And this principle means that we go with the humanitarian aid where it is most needed, without regard to any personal characteristics, including the religious beliefs. Having said that, I can confirm to you that the Commission has been supporting and assisting also members of Christian communities who have been victims of persecution, who have been among refugees, and this assistance is taking place both in Syria as well as in northern Iraq.
Thank you. Follow up.
let's save the time. Afrikában kialakult.
Thank you for your reply. We face even greater humanitarian emergencies in Africa, where religious and ethnic conflicts could give rise to new humanitarian crisis hotspots. Do you agree that the humanitarian policy of the Union must be guided by the principle of bringing help to where it is needed? Or are you willing to follow the good practice of humanitarian agencies of member states?
Thank you, Commissioner Designate.
I'm not sure, Honourable Member, if I got this question right, so I apologize if I misunderstood it. But also in Africa, I will insist that the humanitarian assistance goes where it is needed most, on the basis of the principle of impartiality. We go where there are needs. In doing so, we rely on our partners that come from the United Nations system, like UNICEF, like UNHCR, like World Food Programme, and also, to comparable degree, to non-governmental organizations. Also, in line with our commitments taken in the framework of the Grand Bargain, I will insist on involving, through these partners, also the local civil society, local actors. Because, as I said in my opening speech, they are the ones who know the local environment best, and they are the ones that can provide the humanitarian assistance in a most effective manner.
Thank you. Norbert Neusser, S&D.
Welcome and thank you, dear Commissioner Designate. The question is coming from behind, so it's not a dangerous question, nevertheless. I will continue in German. Sie haben in Ihrem statement.
In your statement, you said that we have more protracted conflicts and natural disasters, and we need effective aid. We need emergency aid, and we need interlinking between civil protection and humanitarian aid. Now, fragile states can't guarantee basic services. Therefore, the population have to be brought into the reconstruction efforts to gain resilience. We've got the nexus to help with development work. I wonder, therefore, how you are going to make the nexus more effective if you become Commissioner, and how do you evaluate the pilot project in Chad, Nigeria, Sudan and Uganda? Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Fortunately, this is a rotating chair, so it's no problem if a question is from behind. Thank you for this question. First of all, I would like to underline that our humanitarian aid activities are fully complementary with civil protection activities. There is no contradiction in that. There is room for both tools, both mechanisms when we deal with emergency response, but also when we deal with the measures like prevention and preparedness. Nexus is something that I value very much, and it has already proven its worth when it comes to nexus between humanitarian and development activities. I intend to pursue that. Why? First of all, because we don't want the humanitarian aid to be needed forever. I don't think that is in our interest. I also don't think that that would be in the interest of the beneficiaries. I think that in their interest, as well as ours, is that they are lifted out of their situation of dependency on humanitarian aid. And here is where I see the role for development to come in, the so-called humanitarian development nexus. I will advocate involvement of both my colleague for international partnerships, Commissioner-designate Urpilainen, and her Commission services, to get involved as soon as possible. from the outset, because already if we tackle long-term needs and root causes of a certain situation, this can also facilitate the transition from humanitarian aid to development cooperation. Recently, this nexus has been expanded by also including the peace component. And also this makes sense. This makes sense because there are situations, for instance, Somalia, where you cannot pursue development cooperation because of security situation there. So we need to work on peace in Somalia if we want to work on development, and if we need to work on development if we want to lift people from the dependency situation.
Follow-up?
Ja, gerne. Mein Kollege Hölveni.
Yes, happily. Now, Mr. Hölveni raised the example of Syria, and I think that is a particular challenge. I wonder, how do you envisage cooperation with the Development Commissioner and the High Representative for External Policy, Vice President Borrell? Do you think that you will be able to get across the concerns to both of them that we in this committee have in respect of humanitarian aid and resilience against the backdrop of Agenda 2020? Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member, for this follow-up. As you know, according to the plan presented by the President-elect von der Leyen, I am to be part of this external action cluster that is to be guided, chaired by High Representative Vice President for Common Foreign Security Policy. I think this is a good solution because undoubtedly the humanitarian aid is part of European Union's external action. It is part of it. However, it is a very special part. It's a part which is governed with the clear set of principles that are different than whatever guides our other external action activities. So my intention is to work closely with the colleagues in this External Cooperation Council cluster, and at the same time defend the humanitarian space and humanitarian principles.
Thank you. Charles Goerens, Renew.
Monsieur le futur commissaire.
Commissioner designate. Looking at the principles that guide humanitarian assistance in the EU and looking at other actors as well, I think the principle of impartiality is one of the most important. The United Nations, the International Red Cross, the other large international organisations that are active in this area are all impartial. You are not deciding if the person who needs assistance is on your side or someone else's side. It's just who's in need. You are simply looking at what the people need, the people who are in distress. I think if we were to move away from this principle, it would be a real risk for us. The EU has a real capacity for action. It has a significant toolbox which includes humanitarian action. Now, if you will allow me, I would give you some advice as a parliamentarian who has been here for 4 parliamentary terms in this committee. You must really defend tooth and nail this principle of impartiality. If this were to be attacked, if the Commissioner in charge looked at other criteria instead, this would affect the reputation of our humanitarian action and affect our work on the ground as well.
Thank you, Commissioner Designate.
Thank you very much, Honourable Member Goerens. Thank you for the recommendations. I value it very much, especially coming from person like yourself with such an extensive experience in this particular field. I would like to stress the following. I don't see this adherence to these principles as just some dogmatic thing. The adherence to these principles, including the principle of independence, of neutrality, this is operational necessity. We cannot afford to be perceived by, let's say, any side, anybody involved in an armed conflict as being on the other side. Because if we are perceived as such, we would endanger the access to humanitarian assistance by the affected population. We would endanger the affected population itself, and above all, we would endanger the safety of humanitarian workers. So the respect for this principle, I'm fully aware, and thank you again for pointing this out. I'm aware this is the sine qua non for European Union's humanitarian aid.
Follow up, 1 minute.
La question additionnelle que je voulais...
The follow-up question has already been answered, so I do not need to ask it again.
Thank you, Mr. Goerens. And you saved the time. Thank you. Then I would like to give the floor to Michel Revasi, Greens.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome, Commissioner Designate. I have a question which is fairly close to my colleagues. You're going to be the Commissioner for Crisis Management, aren't you? The word humanitarian has slipped out of your portfolio, which is rather a shame. But may I ask you this? What criteria will you use in deciding to take action in a humanitarian crisis when there are natural disasters, such as in the Bahamas or the earthquake? It's clear everything's been destroyed and Europe takes action. But if you have other cases which are harder to call, look at what happened in Greece, for example. Austerity measures as a result of Europe's decisions on Greece, and they weren't the only ones. When people no longer had access to medication, when women were no longer able to be treated for cancer or get their children vaccinated, is that something that you would include within humanitarian assistance? I want to understand where you're going to set the yardstick. What standards are you going to apply to that?
Thank you. Commissioner Designate.
Thank you very much, Madam Honourable Member Rivasi. I would like to say first a word about the title of this Commissioner. I think the intention was to make it clear that there is one member of this Commission who is responsible for emergency response in crisis situation. And obviously humanitarian aid is part of European Union emergency response. But it is a distinct part, and I have already gone through that, distinct part governed by distinct principles, and I will insist on that. Now, your question, I think, is really a question for all of us. My answer would be first, we go on the basis of the needs assessment. When we assess that there is a need, we should go, and in accordance with the principle of impartiality. And if this need is within the European Union, we should go within the European Union. I don't think that we could deny humanitarian assistance to affected population within European Union for some conceptual or other reasons. That would be at odds with the principles that I have mentioned already several times. So, in principle, my answer would be yes. Yes, if necessary, we should also go and do humanitarian work within the Union. Actually, it happened already once. It happened during the migration crisis, where humanitarian aid was delivered within the European Union to Greece, to help Greece face the challenge.
Thank you. Follow up.
Well, then, let me put a second question to you. The Haiti earthquake. How should we proceed, Commissioner Designate, when it comes to establishing a link between an emergency situation and development? In Haiti, once you brought in food, it wasn't actually food for the people. It was food from outside. So where's the consistency? When you're bringing food in, surely you've got to bring in stuff that the people can eat. Then seeds, very often foreign seed is imported. GMO seeds, furthermore, which actually disrupt the way farming is organised subsequently. So I'd rather like to know what strategy you're going to implement to make sure that humanitarian aid and development aid are in kilter with one another, because the decisions you take on the one are going to have an impact on the other.
Thank you. Yes, indeed, this is a challenge. It is a challenge for various reasons. Among other reasons also because the procedures that we follow for humanitarian assistance are more flexible, of course, because we need to react quickly and fast in order to save lives, alleviate suffering, and the procedures that are in place for allocating development aid. But I think these kind of challenges can be overcome. They can be overcome by good cooperation, and I will cooperate. I intend to cooperate very well with my colleague Urpi Leinen. I already met with her. We discussed this challenge, and she agrees that we need to work on this because the sooner these two arms of European Union external action work together, the better. The better.
Thank you. Bernard Simniok, ID.
Wir sind uns alle einig, dass wir
I think we're all in agreement that we should be providing this assistance wherever in the world it is needed. But we don't actually have to go that far. Just in front of our front door, just outside of our border, there is a real crisis. These migratory flows we are seeing. We need to be sure that all of this illegal activity that directly or indirectly threatens our citizens is tackled, or that affects the financial interests of the member states. We need to have this stopped at the border. It is vital that the EU does everything in its power to tackle illegal economic migrants. The EU must ensure that the criminality of the human traffickers is dealt with as well, whether we're talking about NGOs, third countries, whether it's associated with the member states. So what do you plan to do to tackle these challenges and deal with these problems on our border?
Commissioner Designate.
Thank you, Honourable Member Zimniuk. First, I would like to underline the fact that humanitarian aid is not a migration management instrument. The European Union has other instruments for that area, and humanitarian aid is not one of them. Second, when we assess the need, if there is a need for humanitarian assistance, we usually focus on people that are forcibly displaced, mainly refugees. That doesn't mean that we would deny humanitarian assistance to migrants, let's say economic migrants. Not at all. But as I said earlier, we have other instruments in place. But if there is also humanitarian need, a need for humanitarian assistance, we would also provide that. Actually, we are doing that, for instance, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, that is unable to cope with the migratory pressure. We go there, even though a part part of the migrants are clearly people who are most likely economic migrants and not refugees. These are so-called mixed migration flows, but we provide humanitarian assistance on the basis of the need and not of the status. That's why we would also go in such areas.
Thank you. Follow up?
Ich habe Ihre Worte sehr wohl vernommen, aber ich...
Well, I've taken on board what you have to say. I see you're active in crisis management, and I see this as a crisis. You can't just talk about it as a volcanic eruption. We're talking about protecting the citizens of Europe. The EU can't secure its own borders anymore. There are terrorists coming in. We have all of these different problems, so we need to be aware of these threats. This is a crisis. We're talking about protecting our own citizens. We're seeing that the EU is failing to secure its own borders. We saw this in the previous mandate, and we won't do this unless we tackle the source of the problem. So what specific measures do you have planned? And I'm talking about a coming crisis here to really protect our citizens, particularly from these illegal migrants that are being brought into the country. And we have to consider the possible health risks as well, the diseases that they could bring in, such as Ebola.
Commissioner Designate.
Was eine Schande ist, sind Sie, liebe Leute hier.
Yeah.
This is a scandal. We're thinking of the European citizens here. These are the taxpayers. They're paying for the EU.
Please, let us now have order. You were over 1 minute as well, and I would also like to remind other members that we give the opportunity to each member to ask their question. I will give the floor to Commissioner Designate.
Thank you. I would like to say that we don't have a crisis, migration crisis. There was migration crisis 2015, 2016. But now, compared to that period, things are more or less under control. Yes, there are migrant movements. Some of them are people who are in need of international protection. Some of others are those who just want a better life, which is a legitimate desire. But I would say that, in my view, this situation is now more or less under control. It is dealt with by the Commissioner for Home Affairs, where it belongs, and I, as a future crisis coordinator, don't think that this could be now treated as an emergency situation where emergency response would be in order.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Jana Kopczynska, ECR.
Panie Przewodniczący.
Thank you very much, Chairman. In the last few years, the humanitarian community has spread out into the private world, working together with corporations and other types of organisation and bringing in new technological solutions for collaboration. Now, the Commissioner Designate has underlined for other areas, has talked about the importance of the private sector. So my question to you is, what do you think about the role of the private sector in humanitarian aid? Will the new Commission be trying to increase the role of the private sector and taking it beyond the range of what we traditionally consider humanitarian aid?
Thank you, Honourable Member, for this question. I think this is a very interesting question when we look ahead. And when we have to deal with the fact that there is an increasing funding gap. The latest situation is that 44% of the humanitarian needs are unaddressed because of the lack of funding. So we should look elsewhere. We should look at the possibility to involve private sector. When we do so, one thing should be made clear. This should not be done at the expense of our adherence to the principles that govern the humanitarian assistance. That's clear. Second, I would also say that nobody should be in a position to make business, so to say, out of humanitarian assistance. That should also not be possible. This should not be an option. Humanitarian aid is a noble mission. It is not a commercial activity and should never become one. Having said that, I still see the possibility for a greater involvement of private sector. Actually, we have witnessed recently, under the current commissioner, and we have seen an interesting expansion in the use of innovative approaches to humanitarian aid delivery, like cash transfers in the form of debit cards. I can easily imagine that the private sector, a banking institution, would be kind enough not to charge all its usual fees and things like that in order to make its own little contribution to the humanitarian assistance. For instance, that's one example. Or when we have still refugee camps in some places, that private companies would assist in equipping them, for instance, with the solar panels, and that would also be something that could be considered. But I repeat, there should be no space for commercialization of humanitarian assistance. There should be no space for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Follow up?
Dziękuję.
Thank you. I agree with what you say. Now, you've made a number of proposals, so actually I don't have a further question. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Miguel Urban Crespo, GUE.
Thank you, Chairman. And thank you also to the Commissioner-designate. The first comment we want to make is that xenophobia must be excluded from this sort of hearing. Secondly, may we say that we were extremely surprised, as indeed my colleague has already mentioned, humanitarian assistance has been removed from the title of your portfolio. We're not the only ones to be surprised with this. Civil society is also surprised by it, and more than just surprised, we're concerned, particularly having heard you say that it's not at all for managing the crisis. That's what the Council was saying right back in 2007. So if humanitarian assistance is being out of this portfolio or not was the question at stake, but we were very glad to hear you say that one of your priorities will be to defend humanitarian law. Humanitarian law is imperiled in many parts of the world. If that is your priority, then my question is, during the course of your term in office, what are you going to do to defend that humanitarian law? For example, suspending trade agreements or proposing any penalties for those countries who fail to observe humanitarian law?
Designate.
Thank you for this question. I do think that I did mention in my opening speech the importance of the international humanitarian law and my commitment to defend it, because, as I said, there is ever more violations. Ever more violations of humanitarian law. We see how humanitarian infrastructure, not just civilian, humanitarian infrastructure is deliberately targeted. We see how the humanitarian aid is blocked and its access to affected population prevented. What will I do about this? First of all, I will speak up about it. I will raise my voice. I will condemn all violations of international humanitarian law. That's what I will do. Second, I intend to work with those organizations that have privileged access to armed actors, be it state armies or non-state armed actors, to draw their attention to the importance of respect of the international humanitarian law. An organization, just for illustration, that has such privileged access in most cases, fortunately, is the International Committee of the Red Cross. And I do count on cooperation with them to instill in all conflict situations better respect for the international humanitarian law. And also, the third thing that I intend to do is, European Union, as you know, does have some training missions in the security sector, in the military sector. I will insist that such trainings include topics like international humanitarian law, gender issues, and things like that.
Follow-up?
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, Chairman. There's a problem here. In this House, we're all too accustomed to speaking out against violations of humanitarian law, but what we need is something tangible. I put 3 specific instances to you, asking you what you would do. First of all, you mentioned humanitarian organisations being targeted or shot at, as we saw in Israel and Palestine. What would happen if we had the flagrant violation of humanitarian law, as we've seen in Israel and Palestine? What would you do? What would you do in the instance of what's happened with the Kurdish people in Turkey? Or again, what Morocco has been doing vis-à-vis the Sahrawi people? Those are 3 examples of flagrant violations of international humanitarian law, where our House generally speaks out without any specific measures being adopted. What about Saudi Arabia and Yemen, for example? Is there an arms embargo imposed on them? No, there's not. That's my question.
Designate.
Thank you. When I say I will speak up in cases of violations, I will do so publicly, but I will also use all available channels, diplomatic, discreet, informal, or through organizations like I mentioned, to persuade all relevant actors, armed actors in a given situation, to respect international humanitarian law. I don't have the power to investigate, and without the power to investigate, I cannot, for instance, say up front whether a violation of international humanitarian law was intentional, as we suspect it was, for instance, in Syria, where we suspect that certain humanitarian infrastructure was intentionally, deliberately targeted, or was it an accident of some sort that might have happened in some other situations? So without clear answers on that, I will limit myself to speaking up publicly against violations wherever they happen, and using all channels, formal and informal, to work with those responsible for respecting international humanitarian law to do so.
Thank you. That was the first round of representatives from the political groups. Now we open up for other members, and I will now give the floor to Hildegard Bentele, EPP.
Sehr geehrter Herr designierter Kommissar Lenarčič.
Commissioner designate, I would like to look at the political guidelines from Ursula von der Leyen.
Ability to help the countries hosting refugees to offer them decent and humanitarian conditions. To this end, I support the establishment of humanitarian corridors. So meine Frage lautet.
So my question would be, what is your position on these humanitarian corridors? Where would you put them in place, and how would you put them in place?
Thank you, Commissioner designate.
Thank you, honourable member, for this question. I don't think that I'm in a position to interpret what President-elect might have in mind, but I can offer you an illustration of humanitarian, let's say, no, I wouldn't call them corridor, but the humanitarian movement. You know that there is a situation right now on one of the Greek islands. All Greek islands that are close to the Turkish shore are overburdened with migrants. So what we need there, and what the Greek authorities are already doing, is that we should ensure that this situation is remedied. If you cannot build larger capacities on the island, then you have to move these people to the continental part of Greece. That's how it is. You cannot keep people in such conditions, because we saw what happened. There was also tragic loss of life of a mother and a daughter. And we should not allow such things happen in Europe. I can't see us reconciling ourselves with such things happening in European Union. This should not happen. There are other situations where you must have humanitarian corridors, and that is where, for instance, in the conditions of military conflict, you need to evacuate civilians in order to prevent casualties or aggravated humanitarian crisis. Yes, and in those situations, there should be humanitarian corridors established for civilian non-combatants to be transferred to a safer location. I hope I was able to answer to your question.
Follow up?
Natürlich auch weit davon entfernt, mich in
I'm not sure if that's exactly what Mrs. von der Leyen meant, but I think it's clearly an important topic for us too. And I think the idea is to put these humanitarian corridors in place where the crises actually are. So could you imagine where that might happen in particular crisis areas where those might be necessary?
Commissioner designate.
I can imagine easily. Actually, I can imagine many places where such measure would be necessary and needed. One situation is Yemen. Yemen is probably the worst humanitarian crisis that we have at the moment, with the largest number of people that are in need of humanitarian assistance, around 20 million people in Yemen alone. So, and at the same time, we have war. We have war, a very ugly war going on. So, yeah, there should be a way to protect non-combatants, to protect civilians, especially the vulnerable groups, and move them to a safer place, to move them outside the conflict zone.
Thank you, and I'll give the floor to Monica Silvana Gonzalez, S&D.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, Chairman. No one, Mr. Lenarčič, can deny climate change. You made that point in your initial statement. All the experts have borne out the fact that approximately 500 million people, just imagine the whole population of the European Union, are going to have to move over the next 50 years. There are indications that in places such as Bangladesh, Mexico or Ethiopia will be the most affected. Climate change is going to imperil food and water supplies around the planet. Is the European Union prepared to square up to that possible future migration challenges as a result of climate change? Climate refugees are the human face of the climate crisis. That crisis is becoming ever more complex and serious, and thousands of people are fleeing from hunger and this destruction of their home settlements every day, and yet the response of the international community and the European institutions has been quite inadequate. So my first question is, how is the Commission going to deal with the lack of a proper legal status for these climate refugees? Thank you.
Commissioner designate.
Thank you, Honourable Member, for this question of extreme actuality, as I would say. It's a very topical issue. I think that we need to do much more and much faster in the area of facing the challenges posed by the impact of the climate change that we already feel. You have mentioned some places in Africa. Yes, Sahel and Horn of Africa are the regions which already very much feel the impact of the climate change. And there are already movements of millions of people that are induced by this impact of the climate change that has already happened so far. I would be hesitant, nevertheless, to call these people as climate refugees. I think that we should leave the term refugees to the category that is very precisely defined in the United Nations Convention related to the status of refugees. I'd rather call these people as people displaced due to climate change, because they can be displaced, and most are displaced within the countries. And as you know, the United Nations definition for a refugee is somebody who has left his or her country. Most of the climate-induced displacements do take place within countries, and we should also help these people. How do we help them? One thing is prevention. I intend to work very closely with Executive Vice President, who is responsible for the European Green Deal. Because we first have to do our homework here at home, in Europe, reduce the emissions and reduce our climate footprint. We should then work with others around the world to do the same. But what we can no longer prevent, we should work on adaptation.
Follow up.
Señor Lenarcic.
Mr. Lenarčič, yes, indeed, that's where the problem lies. The forecasts are extremely worrying, and the protection of these people that you don't want to call climate refugees, well, there's the problem. If we did regard them as refugees, we'd be able to offer them a whole package of protection. These people are not covered by the Geneva Convention. They weren't included back in 1951, as you rightly said. And while the world is reaching an agreement, I think we have to do something here in Europe. We can make progress in creating this definition of climate refugees. So I'd like to get a commitment from you. Will the Commission work towards defining these people as climate refugees, not just displaced persons? And please don't listen to the xenophobic comments we've heard in this hearing this afternoon here.
Commissioner designate.
Thank you. I, of course, listen to all the comments, but that certainly doesn't mean that I agree with all of them. On the contrary, there are some with which I clearly disagree. Now, I do commit to work, especially with the United Nations, because the United Nations is let's call it custodian of the UN Convention related to the status of the refugees. I will work with our partners on the definition of the phenomenon that you described, because one thing is clear: these people need protection. We need to work also on prevention, and we need also to work on climate adaptation. If we do nothing, there will be millions of people on the move. And we need to prevent, we need to adapt, help them adapt, and we need to, yes, I commit to work, especially with our partners in the United Nations system, to achieve a good, workable definition for these people who clearly are in need of assistance.
Chrysola Sakharopoulou, Renew.
Commissioner designate. In the crisis and conflict zones, women and girls are the most vulnerable. They're often raped, forced into marriage, or into sexual slavery. Now, these crimes are repeated, and they're often subject to impunity. Now, the European Union has to answer this problem to protect women and children in these zones as part of its humanitarian aid. How do you think you're going to prevent and protect against sexual violence? how are you also going to meet the Commission's goals on the safety of women as part of your work within your portfolio? Thank you.
Commissioner designate.
Thank you, honourable member, for this question. I cannot imagine humanitarian aid without taking special care to address the specific needs of vulnerable groups, especially women and girls. In our humanitarian work, obviously, women and girls are often exposed to the danger of sexual and gender-based violence, or even worse, are victims of it. So our humanitarian aid should bear in mind this specific situation of women and girls, and should include measures in all the stages of our humanitarian work: prevention, protection, through measures like, there can be very simple measures, I understand. In a refugee compound, you can do a lot for safety and protection of women and girls by installing separate toilets with lights and locks. And that diminishes the problem of the danger of sexual and gender-based violence in a humanitarian setting. This is just one illustration. But in general, we should bear in mind these special needs, and in my view, these special needs also include the sexual and reproductive health services whenever we are dealing with victims of sexual and gender-based violence.
Follow-up.
Dans les situations d'urgence,
Another area that's affected by this sort of crisis is education. And once again, it's girls who are the most vulnerable and who risk losing out on their education, which exposes them to more violence and sexual exploitation. However, education doesn't seem to be one of the priorities under humanitarian aid at a global level. So, Commissioner Designate, how do you see yourself reinforcing the union's actions so that it can guarantee access to education to vulnerable young girls? Are you going to commit the right level of sufficient resources to that?
Designate.
Thank you for this follow-up question. Education will be one of my priorities when I go about the humanitarian aid. Traditionally, the humanitarian aid was focused on food, shelter, water and sanitation, and basic health care. But we know that when September comes, kids have to go to school. They cannot wait for a humanitarian situation to be solved and for development to take place and so on. They have to go to school right away. And this applies to both girls and boys. Girls and boys. No distinction when it comes to education. No distinction absolutely on the basis of gender. Not at all. This is one of key European values, and I will insist on that. I will insist on that we provide education in emergency situations, that we deploy sufficient funding for that, because we cannot afford to lose generations of children who don't go to school because they are in an emergency situation. We should work on expanding this concept of education in emergencies.
And I give the floor to Rasa Juknevisiena, EPP.
Thank you. I am going to speak Lithuanian. Branduoliniai incidentai. Radiological and nuclear emergencies are low probability and high impact events affecting societies in a profound manner.
In your mission letter, you have been entrusted to ensure that the EU is equipped with a well-functioning RESC-EU mechanism and that the EU and its member states have the right number and the right type of assets against chemical and radionuclear hazards. What is the EU's current level of preparedness for external radionuclear threats? How are you planning to assist and protect the EU citizens residing at the EU's external borders? How are you going to ensure that the EU is able efficiently to increase the facility of old and new nuclear facilities along its borders in the south and in the east? Do you consider the task of enhancing the safety of such facilities an important task in your mandate? Thank you.
Commissioner designate.
Thank you, Honourable Member, for this question. Indeed, this is one of specific points that the President-elect included in my mission letter, and of course I intend to take this very seriously. It's my mission to work on that. I think that Europe today is not prepared for such events, as you call them, low probability, high impact. Precisely because there is low probability. I remember the times when there was high probability of nuclear crisis during the Cold War. During the height of the Cold War, I remember in my country, not any bigger building, apartment, not even a church, was allowed to be built without atomic shelter. Now, we kind of think that this cannot happen again. But you're right, it can happen, and we should be prepared. It's difficult to motivate member states to prepare for something that is of low probability. There I see the role of the European Union. Because measures to prepare oneself for such events, nuclear crisis, for instance, is something that the EU could do better, in my view, than member states alone, for various reasons, including, first, funding that is required is probably too much for most member states. Second, impact of such crises, radiological or nuclear, are cross-border. And it's another reason that we work on this at the EU level. We do have to take into account, though, the fact that civil protection is primarily the competence of member states, and the EU only plays a supportive role. But I intend to play this role seriously and intensely. I intend to work with member states to persuade them that this is something that we need, we all, European Union and its member states, because when things happen and we are not prepared, it will be too late.
Follow up?
I will continue in Lithuanian on concrete example of unsafe nuclear power plant in Belarus. Astravo atominė elektrinė
Astravets nuclear power plant in Belarus is a direct threat to citizens of Europe. It is being built only 20 kilometers away from the EU's external border by violating nuclear safety standards. We receive frequent reports of incidents from the construction site. How are you going to provide practical assistance to the affected member states? Do you agree with Parliament's position that the development assistance offered to partner countries may be suspended if the country in question violates nuclear safety standards in a systematic manner? Are you prepared to equip the RESC-EU with adequate assets to reduce the existing risks? Do you agree that adequate EU capabilities must be built in the most exposed EU regions and that security of the EU citizens living alongside the Belarus border must be safeguarded? Thank you.
Commissioner designate.
Thank you for this follow-up. I wouldn't want to speculate on the level of safety of any individual energy infrastructure. Things can happen, incidents may happen anywhere. It happened in Fukushima not so long ago, even though that technology and that nuclear facility was considered not only safe, but in accordance with all the EIA standards and so on. Even so, things can happen. So yes, my answer is yes. I intend to work on building the capability of the European Union to respond to such a low probability, high impact crisis like radiological or nuclear. It happened already. It happened in Europe. There was Chernobyl. Chernobyl happened. And so, yes, my answer is yes, I will work on that, but I will have to, and here I will ask for your understanding, I will have to get the support of the member states, because civil protection is primarily their responsibility. But I will fight for this support. That you can count.
Thank you. Evin Insir, SND.
Thank you so much, Chair. And I would like to continue in Swedish, if you allow me. Tack så mycket, kommissionärskandidat Lenarčič. Först skulle jag bara vilja säga...
Thank you very much. Commissioner Designate, I would just like to say that I'm very pleased to hear that you're sticking so closely to your principles of humanitarian assistance. So here is my question. In 2016, there was a summit where the grand bargain was agreed. So an agreement between donor countries and organizations that implement the humanitarian aid to try and organise more effective humanitarian aid. This is supported by more than 50 organisations and donors. This includes the EU Directorate General that deals with humanitarian assistance. So the Commission is managing the EU humanitarian assistance together with other partners such as the UN, the Red Cross and other NGOs. These NGOs are important in terms of implementation and carrying out this work on the ground. So how do you view these NGOs, these non-state actors, when it comes to providing humanitarian assistance? How can you ensure that this can be properly implemented, that this assistance can be given the financial restrictions and cuts?
Thank you, Honourable Member, for this question. Yeah, I remember very much the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul, and especially the Grand Bargain. I can assure you that I will insist on faithful implementation of all the commitments that the EU entered into, and in particular of the Grand Bargain. And I just learned from my colleagues from the Directorate General that the EU will continue to co-preside the working group on implementation of the Grand Bargain. An important part of Grand Bargain relates to our partner organizations, and yes, a number of them, about half, are non-governmental organizations. They are our trusted partners, and I hope that both sides will stick to the commitments that we entered into within this Grand Bargain. Commitments like that we will simplify reporting. I will go in that direction. But when we go in that direction, we at the same time have to be careful not to jeopardize the necessary controls and assurances that are needed to be in place in order to ensure sound financial management. I don't want another scandal sometime from now that humanitarian aid assistance was diverted or mismanaged, or that there was some sort of fraud involved. We need to, yes, go towards the needs of the NGOs, but at the same time demand the right measures of control and assurances with regard to the financial management of the funds that are actually EU taxpayers' funds. One more word on local NGOs. This is also very important. I mentioned that already in my opening speech. I will encourage our partners, there are more than 200, encourage them to involve local non-governmental organizations for the reasons that I explained earlier.
Follow up, 1 minute.
Tack så jättemycket. I will continue in Swedish again. Och jag måste säga tack för ett så bra svar. Och
Well, thank you very much for a good answer. And in fact, you already touched on my follow-up question, which was about local partnerships with local actors. I think it's very important that those who are active at a local level are brought on board as well. You mentioned these local actors who obviously know best the situation on the ground. So thank you very much.
Designate.
Yes, thank you also for this follow-up. Many of our partners with whom we work already involve local actors, local national NGOs, or they actually represent them, like International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. They have their local outposts everywhere. So this is one of those commitments that I will take very seriously. I will consistently promote the inclusion and engagement of the local partners, both in humanitarian activities as well as in building their capacities in this field, and including them, for instance, in national coordinating mechanisms, so that they participate in a very active manner in the entire cycle of humanitarian assistance.
Thank you, and I'd like to give the floor to Eric Markar, Greens.
Yes, hello. It's question from behind, from your back, and I will ask my question in German. Fangen wir etwas anders an, weil ich eigentlich sagen wollte, dass...
Well, let me just take off on a different tack, because I wanted to say that we can all be very happy that we've grown up or be allowed to live in this safe Europe and that we have access to healthcare. And we can be almost happy about the fact that we're so far removed from the problems of the world, and that we can sometimes even imagine that we're most affected by the world's problems. I think it's important, therefore, that you underlined the role of the NGOs. A bit of a shame for me, because I wanted to ask the same question. But perhaps you could go into a little bit more detail about the following. Could you outline for us how better support can be offered to NGOs? And how are you going to ensure that they are accessible for the people on the ground who have a lot to report back about the work that's going on the ground? Thank you.
Commissioner designate.
Thank you, honourable member. Indeed, non-governmental organizations are among our most trusted and valuable partners. I have difficulty imagining how we would be able to do our humanitarian assistance without them. That's why I think Grand Bargain gives us an opportunity, if we all follow our part of the deal, to work even better together. But that also means that on their side, they will also have to make an effort. We don't like to see, for instance, high percentage of humanitarian aid going to administrative and support costs, so-called overhead. And in the Grand Bargain, there was a commitment that everybody would work on reducing that. This is one thing that we should work together with non-governmental organizations. Second, a special point that regards the local and national NGOs is that most often they lack the capacity. So, capacity to manage funds and things like that. Capacity to participate actively in planning and in preparedness and in coordination. So my idea is that we should find a way to increase this capacity, because the more they're capable, the more they can do for the affected population that are close by, because these are local organizations, and I think that they should be promoted in every possible respect, rather than assistance coming from far away with people who come from far away. I think it can be much more effective if it is locally provided.
Follow up.
Ja, vielen Dank für die Antwort.
Thank you very much for that answer. You also said that it was unacceptable that some NGOs are being hindered in their work and that you wanted to raise your voice against that. Now, not so many 1,000 kilometres away, but actually even on our own borders we can see NGOs being hindered in their work. For the 6th year in a row, hundreds of people have drowned in the Mediterranean. Are you going to raise your voice about this? And what contribution are you going to make so that NGOs saving people in the Mediterranean get more support?
Commissioner designate.
Thank you for this follow-up. It allows me to state very clearly that I'm convinced that the humanitarian activity should never be subject to criminal sanctions. That's one thing that I think should be clear, but apparently isn't. I will state it clearly whenever necessary. People cannot be prosecuted for their efforts in the humanitarian field. That should be clear. At the same time, you mentioned Mediterranean. There are rules of the maritime rescue. These rules give specific responsibility to member states, and they should observe the international maritime law. They should observe international humanitarian law. They should observe human rights standards. They all apply.
Thank you. I would now like to give the floor to Diana Gancia, ID.
I'm going to speak Italian. Prima di porre...
Before I put my question to you, Commissioner Designate, Mr. Lenarčič, I'd like to make this comment. In defining the goals and results, this is something that has to be preferably performed by a degree of realism. So I think you need to define the priorities to be pursued, looking at what are the most urgent issues and the circumstances where our action can provide the greatest added value. With that in mind, Mr. Lenarčič, you will be called upon, it says in your mission letter, to work together with other future commissioners to produce policies that will provide long-term solutions in the areas of humanitarian assistance, development and security. I'd like to know which means you intend to use mainly to address the root causes of mass migratory flows which pose a direct threat to the member states of the European Union.
Grazie.
Commissioner designate.
Thank you, honourable member, for this question. I mentioned what I see as my priorities, and I can gladly, I'm ready to elaborate that a bit more. You mentioned the long-term solutions. Well, humanitarian aid is for immediate relief. Humanitarian aid is something that is aimed at addressing urgent need. But we should be aware all along of also long-term needs and the root causes. Because as I said earlier, we have to work in the direction of affected population getting on their feet, starting their or resuming their productive lives. And we can do so with strengthening this humanitarian development nexus. I will repeat myself, I know, but I intend to work very closely with my colleague, Commissioner-designate Urpilainen, so that from the outset we also have this long-term dimension covered whenever possible in order to address the root causes and to work in the direction of addressing the long-term needs of the affected population. There is another important aspect that I do intend to cover, and that is in the form of prevention and building resilience so that people are more resilient to the crisis, to the next crisis when that may come. And I can tell you with satisfaction that a large majority of our humanitarian activities already includes the disaster risk reduction component.
Follow up?
No, it's okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Then we go on, and I give the floor to Jana Kopczynska, ECR.
Thank you very much. In the last few years, natural disasters have hit almost all parts of the EU, creating hundreds of injuries and deaths and billions of damage to infrastructure. Earthquakes, floods, all sorts have really tested the anti-crisis reaction system in member states to the limits. Fears about security are also now more complex, particularly if you consider that climate change is going to create greater natural disasters in the future. In order to better protect citizens, we need an integrated system in order to protect Europe from natural disasters. Now, RESC-EU is relatively new, so I wonder if you already have some conclusions about how effectively RESC-EU works so far.
Thank you, Honourable Member, for this question. RESC-EU is just starting, just beginning to work. The first deployment took place of the RESC-EU assets in Greece last summer, and my focus will be on implementing this enhanced civil protection mechanism, also referred to as RESC-EU. We will need to make sure that the European Union has the right assets at its disposal. And this is also something that President-elect has included in my mission letter. I will work with member states who are responsible to make this happen. I will work with them in order to make sure that the procurement process starts with a view to equip the European Union with the assets that we need. These assets are expensive. That's why there is a substantial budget foreseen. It is about firefighting planes, firefighting helicopters, but also medical evacuation facilities and facilities related to the chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear preparedness measures. So I intend to work on all this so as to make this whole rescue package a reality. But again, my challenge will be primarily to persuade the member states that this is something good, that this is what is in their interest, and I intend to do so from day one.
Follow up?
Była już o tym mowa, pan przed chwilą.
It's already been mentioned by a colleague, and you've touched on this as well, but I did just want to ask if you have specific proposals about further reinforcement of the European Union's capacity for reaction and to prevent against natural disasters or the effects thereof, or other threats like, for example, accidents that require medical support, chemical accidents, nuclear accidents, that sort of thing. I'd also like to ask whether you are planning to cooperate with the ECDC's Reaction and Emergency Crisis Centre.
Commissioner designate.
I'm afraid I didn't catch the last part. Am I planning to cooperate with whom?
You can have the floor again if you want to clarify the question.
With whom? The last sentence of your question.
The Centre for Cooperation and Crisis Reaction from the ECBC.
I'll have to find out about that institution. I have to admit that I have not been familiar with it. But as for the assets, yes, indeed. I intend to work on, first, making sure that we have the required number of firefighting planes. We are not there yet. There are some, and they were deployed successfully last summer in Greece. We'll need to complement that also with some firefighting helicopters. There are two other areas where rescue is supposed to be equipped with reserve assets, and that is medical evacuation and chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear preparedness assets. Those are not available in most European Union member states, and that's one more reason why I think we should build them. We should build this capacity at the EU level, but ultimately this will depend on the member states because they are the ones who decide about procuring these assets. My role is to persuade them that this makes sense.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Lucas Mandel, EPP.
Thank you, Mr. Lenarčič. First of all, I congratulate you on being nominated as a new commissioner. All of us should never forget that it's a privilege to serve the European people in public office. And thank you for your presentation so far. What I yet liked most about your presentation was that you mentioned the external action cluster you will be part of in European Commission, since I think that the more commissioners take care of the strength of Europe to the outside, the better, since I assume we should not regulate too much to the inside, but strengthen Europe to the outside. And that's part of your crisis management capacity. So I ask you, what's your specific role in the external action cluster you mentioned? And more specifically, since it's also about prevention, if we do a right crisis management after natural disasters, even not only after conflicts, armed conflicts, also after natural disasters, if we do a right crisis management outside Europe, we take care of peace and stability in these countries and avoid even more terrible conflicts. What specifically do you intend to do in order to take care of prevention?
Commissioner designate.
Thank you, honourable member, for this question. I think it's very important that also the Commissioner for Crisis Management has a seat at the external action table. It is obvious that humanitarian aid in particular is part of European Union external action. But I feel the need to repeat here that this is a specific, self-standing part governed by specific principles, including, maybe I should mention another principle here, principle of independence. Decisions on allocating humanitarian assistance should be taken independently from European Union's other objectives, political, military, economic, strategic, whatever. This independence is something I will defend also at the table of the External Action Cluster. But we should work in coordinated manner. And I'm looking forward to working with High Representative Vice President Borrell, with whom I already met, and we already had a first exchange. And I agree with you, prevention is an area where we should specifically look, because it's easier to combine a wide range of European external action instruments and tools with in the stage of prevention. And it's not only easier, it's also more economic, because as you know, every euro invested in prevention of crises and disasters saves anywhere up to €7 that are necessary for facing the consequences of disasters.
Follow up?
Thank you. 2 days ago in this very meeting room, Jutta Urpilainen, nominee for the Commissioner for Development, mentioned that she wanted to cooperate with the Crisis Management Commissioner, so with you in the field of education for especially children, for boys and girls, as we clarified that time, in refugee camps. And that's a very important issue I want to insist on, and I ask you to cooperate, and I hope this wouldn't harm your independence in the field you want to decide independently, as you have mentioned. And if I may add only one sentence on civil protection, we had this issue in the last mandate. The situation in the member states is very different. So please take care of the fact that some things are taken care of better in some states and less good in other states, and this independence is important on the member states level.
Commissioner designate?
Yes, thank you. I can assure you that I will work closely with my colleague Urpilainen, especially in the area of education. This is an area where our mandates do not overlap, but do come together, I would say. I see my role as making sure that even in emergency situations, like refugee camps, a humanitarian setting, we don't neglect education. That's why I like this concept, education in emergency. And I will promote it, I will work on it, I will expand it, because, as I said earlier, when September comes, children, boys and girls, have to go to school.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Catherine Chabot, Renew.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. Commissioner Designate, I would like to come back to the link between humanitarian aid and development, but perhaps we could be more ambitious here, looking at island states that are particularly affected by extreme weather phenomenon. So, for example, Irma or Dorian, that severely affected whole states. There was Saint-Martin, for example. I went to the island a year and a half after the cyclone had passed through. They had received aid from Europe for rebuilding. However, there was still waste, debris to be found and building to be done. So having spoken to local people, I saw that actually this tragedy could be an opportunity to really change the model that we have of humanitarian aid and the link to sustainability. We could really see a commitment towards energy independence, water independence, in food as well. So do you think that the management of these crises could actually be an opportunity if we can come up with a real strategy to strengthen sustainable development in these island states and more resilience to natural disasters?
Commissioner designate?
Thank you very much, Honourable Member, for drawing my attention to the situation of small island developing states. They indeed are among the most vulnerable in view of the climate change that is happening. We know that the Arctic and Antarctic ice are melting. We know that the sea levels are already rising, and we know that we have a host of islands out there in the Caribbean and especially also in South Pacific that are going to face very dire challenge. And since these are countries with modest resources, we should work with them and we should help them prepare. I'm afraid there are situations and events that we can no longer prevent. And I have in mind in particular the extreme weather-related events or the rising sea levels. We know this is happening, we know this will happen, we know that situation will get worse. What is important is that we do not sit on our hands and we work with these small island developing states and improve their resilience, improve their preparedness. That's where I see my role, but I also see the role of my colleague Urpilainen, because the development budget should also be oriented towards enhancing preparedness and resilience, or if you wish, climate adaptations, especially in situations where we can no longer prevent bad things from happening, or in situations where we know that certain events are quite predictable.
Follow-up.
Oui, vous avez évoqué vous avez évoqué la nécessité de s'appuyer sur les.
As well, you mentioned the need to rely on local actors to help bear the cost. Well, thanks to our overseas territories, Europe has a presence everywhere in the world. So don't you think it would be to our advantage to make more of that unique geostrategic advantage and pinpoint the humanitarian and logistic resources available there, and NGOs for one thing? Wouldn't that enhance our ability to react and protect our presence when these extreme events occur? It would also allow us to take swifter action in helping people affected by emergencies all around the world. Don't you think that would be part of any proper intervention strategy?
Thank you. I agree that this is the way we should try to favor, build local resilience and not focus only on our ability to respond or to help respond. This has to be there also. This has to be there because once disaster takes place, help is necessary and we should be able to provide it. So we should not neglect none of these elements. But yes, I intend to work more on the resilience. I intend to work in this domain closely with other colleagues, other commissioners who are responsible for climate, environment and oceans, development, we already mentioned several times, because we should all work together. We should factor in this Green Deal of Europe, but also not just Europe. I think that what we need is a Green Deal for the planet. We should factor in the climate adaptation measures, resilience building measures, preparedness measures in order to either avoid or be better prepared for disasters.
Thank you. Now I'd like to give the floor to James Wells, non-attached. Not here. We go on. Then I give the floor to Nikos Androulakis, SND.
Commissioner designate, I would like to ask you a question. After the wildfires, the forest fires, the destructive wildfires in Portugal, Greece and Sweden in the summer of 2017 and 2018, last March we reviewed the regulation, the European regulation of civil protection. We created Rescue EU. We are in a transitional phase. and the means that we have at our disposal belong to member states. Now we need European means. You also mentioned that we have to see how the member states will react. How will you assure that rescEU will have all the necessary means in order to combat fires and other problems, and how will you overcome, let's say, the hesitance of member states to acquire those means or obstacles? What are the priorities for the European Union in order to have a fully functional rescEU mechanism? Thank you.
Commissioner designate.
Thank you, honourable member, for this question, which allows me to elaborate a bit further on this. Yes, the President-elect wrote in my mission letter that she expects me to ensure, exactly this is the verb that she used, to ensure that we have within the rescEU the right kind of assets and the right amount of them. But at the same time, we know that it is the member states that have to decide to procure these assets. So all I have at my disposal is power of persuasion and hopefully also the support of the European Parliament. I think that you can help me a lot in this task by urging the member states to procure these kind of assets. And I think it should not be so difficult. I have to say that personally I'm a bit surprised at this slow procurement moving forward, slow movement of this procurement. Why? Because to me it looks a very good deal. You know, once a member state X decides to procure, let's say, firefighting plane, EU, according to the rescEU rules, can co-finance it up to 90%. So you get, basically, as a member state, you get the asset for 10% of the price. You can use it. The only thing that you sign up to is the obligation that when there is a need somewhere else, you have to give this asset, you have to make it available to be used where there is a need, as a, let's call it, reserve asset of the EU. But when this is not the case, you can use it your own, and you get the asset for 10% of the price.
No, the problem is to find the 90% of the money for the member states to be able to acquire the assets, the firefighter planes, for example. Concerning prevention, I have a question. In the mechanism, we had included the need for the member states to deposit the plans of civil protection and to be able to share the plans. Now, the elements given by the member states concerning the risks, the prevention and how to face the dangers, the data given and the plans are the ones required, or you need more data and more often? And how can we upgrade these national civil protection plans in order to reduce the natural destructions? The national disasters, excuse me.
Yes, thank you for this. Member states should all have in place, in my view, workable risk reduction strategies and risk management strategies in general, and also early warning systems. And the EU should help them. And I'm ready to help them. Because prevention and in the area of civil protection is the responsibility. I prefer the word responsibility to the word of competence, because when you talk about competences, we try to fight with others. But when we talk about responsibilities, people are not fighting for greater responsibility. That's why I like the word responsibility. It's the responsibility of member states. Civil protection is the responsibility of member states. And they should put these kind of things in place. I will be there to help, because we have expertise, we have good practices from elsewhere, we have mechanisms and experts that we can provide, and I'm there to help the member states assume and implement this responsibility.
And I give the floor to Ludmila Novak, EPP.
Spoštovani gospod Honourable Commissioner Designate Mr. Janez Lenarčič, welcome to the European Parliament. I hope I get your response in Slovenian, which is your mother tongue. We've been discussing about the fact that the EU is sensitive to people in need as well as the countries that find themselves in an emergency, and so is one of the biggest donor, and the aid is set to increase. I would like to know whether you believe that the current system of aid distribution through NGOs is efficient enough, transparent enough, and also leads to long-term positive effects. Unfortunately, we often hear that different non-governmental organizations, by way of redistributing these funds through a chain of transfer, finance organizations that do not work in compliance with European values. Are you going to upgrade this system?
Commissioner Designate.
Thank you, Honourable Member of Parliament. I would like to thank you for this opportunity to respond in my mother tongue. Of course, this is our right, thanks to the interpreting service. We, the European Union, have been managing humanitarian aid based on the cooperation with partner organizations, specialized agencies of the UN on one side, and on the other side, the NGOs. Believe me, we conduct a thorough control to determine whether these organizations are capable to function as needs be. We have to ensure the compliance with the main principles: independence, impartiality, humanity. As well as another principle which is difficult to translate from English for me. I've been using English when dealing with this terminology. We consider whether these international organizations are capable of controlling the aid that they receive. These funds are funds paid for by European taxpayers. But even the more important thing is what they're used for: to save human lives, to help those in need. And that's why we are so thorough in controlling our partners, to determine whether they're capable of using these funds in an adequate way, so that these funds aren't lost, so that they're redistributed to the right beneficiaries, not to the wrong beneficiaries. We also have established effective mechanisms of control, and we, of course, control the use of these funds in both directions. Thank you. I'm sure that you know the example of Peter Opeka, our missionary who has Slovenian roots and who works on Madagascar. He's been dealing with poverty in the following way. He's actually taught people how to fish, and his settlement was built on a garbage dump, so to speak. He helped people on the basis of voluntary funds, and now this system has been upgraded and developed, so people help each other. I think this is the best way to develop the management of crisis situations. You've also mentioned local competences and local actors, and this is also an opportunity to teach local people and train them to deal with these crises in the future. Are you supportive of preventive programs that are going to train and reinforce people to deal with these situations?
Commissioner Designate.
Thank you very much. I'm well familiar with the work of Mr. Opeka. I admire this man. This is a very good example of functioning on the local level, how we're able to deal with poverty. The Commission, of course, is supportive of such activity. Personally, if I do become Commissioner, I probably won't deal with him directly. However, maybe we'll be able to cooperate within the framework of prevention when we try to improve the resilience of his community and other communities like his. And we'll also try to achieve sustainable development goals. Many of these goals can be achieved only by means of doing away with humanitarian crises, and only if we're able to effectively prevent these situations. The work of Mr. Opeka is an excellent example of good, effective work when it comes to preventing humanitarian crises and increasing the resilience of local communities. And of course, we all owe a debt to him.
I would now like to give the floor to Manon Aubrey, GUE.
Merci beaucoup, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman. I want to come back to something that's been touched upon a number of times already. This week and today, the president of Solidarity Republican Action in France, an NGO, has been called in by the intelligence services because he reported on arms sales by France. It wasn't a state secret that they were revealing, but in fact it was a bit of state hypocrisy. The EU is sending humanitarian aid to populations that are being massacred, but countries like France are exporting arms to their killers. Arms sales are helping people to commit crimes against humanity, as in Yemen, and you said yourself that was one of the most urgent crises. There are rules on technological exports and military exports in the EU, adopted in 2008, and which include human rights in their criteria. How are you going to coordinate humanitarian aid from the EU with the application of those provisions? Thank you.
Commissioner designate.
You mentioned, honourable member, the arms trade, and yes, in principle, I agree. Humanitarian crises are often, if not always, partly, at least, if not fully, the consequence of the armed conflict. And armed conflicts are fought with weapons. And yes, many countries export those. But this is the reality that we have to deal with. I will, of course, advocate care in exporting arms to conflict regions. Actually, there are standards that European Union should, in my view, advocate, and namely that in arms exports we do not act in a way that would aggravate the humanitarian situation. I feel this is my duty. It will be my duty if I'm Commissioner for humanitarian aid, crisis management, to point out to the fact that yes, we should behave consistently. We should not export arms in such a way that would aggravate humanitarian crisis.
Follow-up?
J'entends votre engagement et j'y suis.
I hear what you say, that you're very committed, and I have a lot of time for that. I think within the EU we recognise the role and the responsibility that member states have in exporting arms to these states and the impact that they have in terms of the humanitarian crises caused. Now, based on this spoken commitment, would you be prepared to move towards sending out a strong signal from the EU to go further and to implement what a number of NGOs, including Amnesty, are trying to get in place, namely an embargo to exporting arms to conflicting parties, particularly where there are flagrant abuses of international humanitarian law, as we have seen, for example, in the very sad case of Yemen?
Commissioner designate.
I intend to work with my fellow commissioners in order to look into this matter more consistently. I personally believe that, yes, we should have a principled approach also in this area. We should have a principled approach in the sense that when there is a conflict going on, that we are careful about what we do, including in the area of arms exports. It would be self-defeating for the European Union, which is rightly proud to be a major, biggest humanitarian donor, together with its member states, of humanitarian aid. It would be self-defeating if at the same time, on the other hand, we would do things that aggravate humanitarian crisis in particular place. But one should be aware of the fact that there are competences and responsibilities, and some of them are purely in the domain of member states. What I can do is I can advocate for this principled approach, and I will say what I already said here. I think that our action should be consistent. We should avoid aggravating humanitarian crisis through our actions in the area of arms exports. But it's not the European Union that exports arms, it's member states.
Thank you, and I will give the floor to Isabel Santos, SND.
President, I'm going to speak in Portuguese. Senhor Comissário.
Commissioner designate, the growing level of international conflict, the climate crisis that we're going through, pose ever greater challenges when it comes to the level and quality of our response and what we do to ensure that human rights are properly respected within our response. I've been listening very carefully, and I note your intention increasingly to involve the NGOs, including local NGOs. That's extremely important to me, and this is very much in line with your job as the head of ODIHR. I was able to go along with you and watch you at work defending activists and what they were doing on the ground, with increasing involvement of NGOs there. There are never enough of us to make sure we have a really effective, high-quality humanitarian response. Now, I heard you talk about the grand bargain, but what about transparency in implementing the agreements? I'd like to hear you say something more about coordination, because when we go to emergency situations on the ground and look at our humanitarian response, very often what you find is there's a lack of coordination, and that leads to a lot of resources being wasted. So may I ask you what you intend to do to enhance the quality of that coordination of resources?
Commissioner designate.
Thank you, Honourable Member Santos. It's a great pleasure, let me say, to see you here. Now transported from our OSCE planet in the past, we find ourselves again on the same EU planet this time. It's a great pleasure to see you, Madam. Coordination is always a challenge whenever you have so many players like you have in international humanitarian universe. There is a multitude of agencies, organizations, non-governmental organizations. But I think there are some obvious solutions and some principles that if we follow them, things should work well. First of all, I think we should all agree that the United Nations, and in particular its Office for Coordination of the Humanitarian Affairs, should have the overall coordinating role. The European Union supports it, and I will support it. And it will be one of my first steps, if I'm confirmed, to enter into contact with the United Nations and its Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. I think they should keep this overall organization. But also the European Union should instill this spirit of coordination and cooperation, so that everybody knows what to do, everybody knows what his or her tasks are in a given humanitarian operation. It would be really a waste, unfortunate waste, if in the area where we have such a funding gap, we would waste resources due to lack of coordination. It happens. I know it happens. There were cases in the past, like many years ago, Haiti and so on. But I think we should strive to instill some discipline here, and we should recognize the role of the United Nations as an overall coordinator, and also we should divide among ourselves what we will do, each of us, in a coordinated and cooperative manner.
Thank you. Follow up.
Mr. President, ouviu aqui falar da situação.
Now, we've heard reference made here to the humanitarian situation in refugee camps in Lesbos. As we attempted to stem the flow of migrants, we reached agreements with Libya. We all know what the situation in Libya is regarding refugees and migrants, and we're all very familiar with the situation in the detention centres for refugees in Libya. In humanitarian terms, it's an atrocious situation which violates human rights. I would like to hear you comment on that and tell us how you intend to tackle that problem.
Commissioner designate.
Thank you. Yes, you are absolutely right. The situation in the detention centres in Libya is atrocious. That's the right word. The Commission is trying to help. We are there. We do have humanitarian programs, humanitarian assistance, and but this situation, of course, cannot go on. It cannot go on. I think that those people should be moved from those centres somewhere else. Now, some of them can be resettled. Some of them could be, especially those who are not entitled to international protection, would be helped to return to their countries of origin. But yes, I agree. It's a very bad situation, and just humanitarian aid is not a solution. I said already that humanitarian aid is not a crisis management tool in the sense that it would solve crisis. It tries to address the needs, the immediate needs of the affected population. That's what we are trying to do, also in the detention camps in Libya. But more should be done. Yes, I agree. We should find a more sustainable solution.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Alexandra Louise Rosenfield Phillips. Greens.
I know you've had similar questions to this already, but as Crisis Management Commissioner, will you work on the cost of doing nothing? Are you aware of how many people could be in need of humanitarian support following climate-related disaster by 2030 and 2050 if the world does not urgently invest in climate adaptation measures today? If no urgent action is taken now, the number of people in need of humanitarian assistance annually due to the climate crisis could double by 2050. Similarly, financial costs could balloon to €18 billion per year. But this pessimistic scenario could be avoided by investing in climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction, building up resilience in communities, countries and regions at risk, and by improving early warning humanitarian action. How will you better integrate a greener approach in the field of humanitarian aid? And what concrete measures will you take to this end? What funds will you mobilise in order to deal with environmental emergencies and climate disasters? Thank you.
Commissioner Designate.
Thank you, Honourable Member, for this very important question. I would return back to where I was already when I said that I think we should mainstream disaster risk reduction measures into our Green Deal for Europe and also Green Deal for this planet. We should do so because I totally agree with you. The cost of doing nothing will be many times higher than what we can do and must do in order to prevent or at least prepare and adapt. There are already things that we can no longer prevent, but we can at least adapt. And I will work on that. I will speak with Executive Vice President Timmermans and argue in favor of including disaster risk strategy in all the climate activity of the Union. Precisely because if we don't do it, we will face a much worse situation. We will face it unprepared, and then we'll have to invest much more than if we do invest now. I already said today, €1 invested in prevention saves up to €7 that you need when you face the consequences of something that you could have prevented or at least prepared for.
Follow-up?
I appreciate that response. As already mentioned this evening, the Commission plans to increase the participation of the private sector in its external action operations. However, there are provisions to keep the private sector to the same standards as international organisations and NGOs. How do you intend to ensure that the private sector involved in crisis management projects will meet the same do no harm standards with regard to CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions as international organisations? Would you endeavour to make polluting companies which are responsible for the impacts of climate change contribute to a for climate or environmental disasters? Thank you.
Commissioner Designate.
Thank you for this follow-up. Yes, I think we should all work with the private sector. I think that especially the Executive Vice President and the Commission as a college won't be able to deliver on the Green Deal for Europe and for the world if we don't involve private sector. Because for a simple reason, the EU funds are not nearly sufficient for the investment necessary to make the Green Deal a reality. And this also goes for the prevention and preparedness measures that I feel are also my responsibility because this is a part of the crisis management cycle. Some people think that crisis management, this is somebody who sits there and waits for the phone to ring, there is a crisis and then we run and respond. At least as important stages, in my view, are prevention and preparedness. At least as. Well, actually, more important because they're cheaper. And since we have limited funding, let's fund these cheaper stages better. And hopefully we will avoid this response stage. So I intend to work in this respect with my colleagues, other commissioners, responsible for climate, environment and oceans, for development, and all these areas, because Green Deal is something that is our common objective, our common responsibility. I intend to contribute to it in the way that I described.
I would like to give the floor to Véronique Trélé-Lenoir, Renew.
Thank you, Mrs. President, Mr. Commissioner Designate. Today, more than 80% of the world's population is threatened by vector-borne infectious diseases. This threat is now concerning Europe. What I heard just in front of me to suggest that it could be due to migratory movements is at least medically incorrect. Mosquitoes, ticks, and other disease-causing insects are allowed to proliferate and adapt due to climate change through global warming, not to migration. These insects now invade new territories in Europe, and epidemics of dengue, malaria, chikungunya, and Nile fever are arising in Croatia, in Greece, in Italy, and in my country, France. Tomorrow, new ones. Mr. Commissioner-designate, these insects carry a significant risk of sanitary crisis in the future. How do you intend to protect Europeans against these vector-borne new diseases? Thank you.
Commissioner-designate.
Thank you, honourable member, for this question. I think that the threat is real. I think that your point is very much warranted. The threat of vector-borne diseases moving to Europe from its now exotic places is a real thing. And I think we are not prepared. I think we are not prepared at all. I think we should start preparing, because diseases that were once typical only for tropical parts of the world, and that we encountered only when we were traveling to exotic locations, they're coming our way. Yes, and I agree with you. They're not coming. They're not being brought into Europe by people. They are brought by insects. I think, first of all, if we want to tackle this, I should work with my colleague, Commissioner-designate for Health, Stella, and we should look into this, how best to prepare. She, as a person that will have at her disposal all the Commission services in the health domain, and I see my contribution as a emergency response coordinator, in the sense of preventing the response that we don't want to see take place. I think there are many ways to prepare. First of all, I think we could think of developing the vaccines. We could think of storing them for a case when an epidemic disease epidemics erupt, and I think that one of the options, why not, could be through the rescEU mechanism to have such vaccines stored in place, ready for an eventuality of epidemics caused by vector-borne diseases.
Follow-up?
I want to thank the Commissioner-designate for his very honest answer. We are not prepared, and I just wanted to warn and to give an alert, not asking unanswerable questions. I suggest that you should work on warning systems, work on the awareness of potential risk among health workers and citizens, and reinforce the agencies, in particular ACDC, on these type of diseases. Thank you very much.
Commissioner-designate?
Yes, Madam. I intend to do so. I intend to do in close cooperation with Commissioner for Health.
Thank you, and I would like to give the floor for the last question from Frances Fitzgerald, EPP.
Thank you. Better late than never. Good evening, Commissioner-designate. And another question about a central issue that has been raised by many of my colleagues. It's my understanding from your mission letter that your role in crisis management includes a preventative and mitigating role as well.
And it's clear, as colleagues have said, that over the past number of years, through events such as the devastating hurricanes, forest fires, and so on, that climate change is increasingly resulting in major disasters across the world, with all of the consequences we've seen. And I'd like to ask you again how you will seek to integrate preventative and mitigating measures as regards climate change and climate resilience into both the internal and external policies of the Union in conjunction with your Commissioner colleagues. Because I believe that increasingly over the next number of years it is going to be about Commissioners working together across portfolios in a united way.
Commissioner designate.
Thank you, honourable member, for this question. Yes, that is the point. I don't think that any commissioner on his or her own would be able to work on these issues. I think that this will be a particular challenge for this future College of Commissioners to find a way of effectively working together on issues like this. From my part, I see in particular the possibility of my input in the sense of prevention, and when that is no longer an option, adaptation. And how does it work? Let me attempt with an illustration. We mentioned already today the Sahel and Horn of Africa as regions that already feel the impact of the climate change. The rain patterns have changed, the droughts have multiplied, they are longer. So what do we do? What can we do in order to adapt? The one way of doing it is that you look at the crops that are traditionally present there and see whether they can be replaced with some other crops that are more drought resistant, heat resistant. That is not something that I, as a future commissioner, would decide, but it's something that our development colleagues would have to decide in cooperation with agricultural specialists that know about that region. So it means that in order to have effective prevention and adaptation, we have to work together first within the Commission, but then also with our partners outside the European Union, that's how we will be able to put in place effective measures to prevent and mitigate, as you said, the impact of the climate change.
Follow up?
I spoke about working cross commissioners, cross portfolios, but you've just actually begun to address my second question, which was about emphasising the need to work with civic society, NGOs, and building very strong partnerships and continuing to do that within the EU and also in our third country relationship, and putting citizens really at the heart of all of these processes. And I think we're going to need both very much, even more developed than they are at present.
Commissioner designate.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. It is correct. We need to involve also the non-governmental organizations. I see all these efforts as an important part in our ambition to fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals. And the strategy to achieve those goals is that we involve all the actors, and NGOs are important actors, and especially in the area of humanitarian assistance, we have most positive experience with working with the NGOs. They are our trusted partners, they are our reliable partners, effective partners, and I think that it's a good example of how this cooperation can look and should look when we work jointly in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals.
So let me thank all the members for the questions and of course the Commissioner designate for your answers. Okay, we just have a question now, if we're going to allow another questions or not. I think that's the matter. I give you the floor just to speak on this question then, okay?
Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Designate. I didn't want you to feel hard done by because we had only 24 questions because one member did not turn up to this meeting. So with the permission of the Chair, I would like to ask a replacement question.
To be honest, we have already divided the groups between the political groups, and the question was from a non-attached member. So I think that I will not allow the question. I'm sorry. I don't want to be the bad guy, but somebody has to kind of stick to the rules. And I do know that we have had a lot of questions between the committees, between the associated committees. So that's why I'm being a bit harsh at this moment and this late night. I'm sorry. I would also like to announce that I will meet with the coordinators to evaluate this hearing. It will be behind closed doors. You know where and when. Let me be very clear that I will not accept you being, you cannot send any political advisors to replace you during this meeting. I will only accept members to be, you can have your advisors at the meeting, but I will not accept that you replace yourself at the meeting. But now, I would also like to give the floor to the Commissioner Designate for a statement. You have 5 minutes. Please.
Thank you very much, Honourable Chair, and thank you, Honourable Members, for this exchange, for this opportunity. It was stimulating for me. I appreciate very much your questions. I tried to answer them to the best of my abilities. I do hope that I was able, at least to some degree, to satisfy your expectations so far. Let me say that in case I am confirmed for this position, I can tell you I already feel the weight of the responsibility on my shoulders. I don't take this portfolio lightly. I take it with considerable excitement because it is a noble mission. It is a way to show the best face of Europe around the world and within the Europe. The solidarity is something that people don't think about until the moment they need it, and then they remember it forever. I would like, if I'm confirmed, to work with you very closely to build on what I think is a traditional partnership between this particular portfolio and the European Parliament. And allow me one last remark with regard to my mission letter. I was waiting for somebody to ask the question about the first item that President-elect put in my mission letter, and it relates to the Emergency Response Coordination Center, that I'm supposed to strengthen it and make it work like a real hub. Since nobody asked the question, I will nevertheless use this opportunity to say the following. This is a wonderful thing. I was impressed when I visited. Please, if you haven't visited yet, do so. It's worth it. It's impressive. And also, it's impressive towards the outside world, because this center responds to calls for assistance not only from within the European Union, but also from any country in the world. So I want to answer the famous question that Henry Kissinger asked a while ago. What is the phone number of Europe? Well, when it comes to emergency response, this is it.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Designate. Thank you all the members, and thank you everybody who has participated in this meeting. Now we end this hearing.